The Brave Little Toaster was released as a novella in 1980 by Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. Its author, Thomas M. Disch, was more well known for darker material, like his novel Genocides, about an alien race that comes to Earth to, do the title thing. A few years after The Brave Little Toaster's release, an animated film of the same name was released to theaters by Hyperion Pictures. The Brave Little Toaster was produced using money by a subsidiary of Disney, but they had no direct hand in production. The film was produced independently using animators and talent who would go on to found Pixar, and The Brave Little Toaster's tone, themes, and execution align much more with Pixar than they do with Disney's in-house animated films. In this video, we're going to talk about the original novella, the production history of the film, and the themes within this work that touch upon much darker and heavier philosophical ideas than you would expect from a film ostensibly aimed at children. So, let's get into it. After reading the novella sometime in the early 80s, animator John Lasseter convinced the Walt Disney Company to purchase the rights to Thomas L. Disch's The Brave Little Toaster. Lasseter was developing computer-generated animated shorts at this time, and he had just finished production on an animated short based on Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. Because of the limitations of computer animation at this point, Lasseter was drawn to the main characters of Disch's novel. Animation from computers was stiff and lifeless at this time, so Lasseter figured a movie starring household appliances would be a natural fit. However, when Lasseter pitched the full idea to Disney executives, they rejected his pitch. The only way they would agree to make a feature-length animated film using computer generation would be at the promise that the film would be cheaper and easier to produce. Since Lasseter's pitch actually asked for a bit more than a standard animated feature, Disney killed the project. While Lasseter lost The Brave Little Toaster as Pixar's first animated feature film, it's easy to see how elements of the novel ended up becoming Toy Story, Pixar's actual first animated feature film. Luxo Jr., the proof-of-concept short film Lasseter used to gain eventual funding for Pixar, features an anthropomorphized lamp with a life and personality all of its own, an element clearly inspired by the same character in The Brave Little Toaster. Luxo Jr. is even a part of the Pixar logo to this day. After Disney rejected the theatrical pitch from John Lasseter, the rights and concept for The Brave Little Toaster landed at Hyperion Pictures. Hyperion Pictures was created in part by Thomas Wilhite, Willard Carroll, and Chris Young, all special effects crew for Disney's 1982 film Tron. At Hyperion, The Brave Little Toaster became an independent animated production. The original Disney budget of $18 million was taken down to $6 million, and the film began pre-production. The Brave Little Toaster was seen by Disney as a budget title, and its fate was destined for a cable TV premiere. However, the writer and director, Jerry Reese, was ready to make a name for himself as an animator and storyteller, and he encouraged the crew to do their best work to really prove themselves to the Disney bosses. Jerry Reese went on to become a major contributor to Pixar's success. In fact, many of the crew for The Brave Little Toaster went on to have extraordinary careers in animation, backing many of the Disney successes of the late 90s and early 2000s. Because Hyperion was working independently of Disney animated studios, The Brave Little Toaster was able to retain the darker and more complicated themes of the source novel. Jerry Reese also decided to make unusual choices for this time when it came to gathering voice talent for the film. Instead of using traditional voice actors, which Reese claimed were too childlike and enthusiastic for the tone he was looking for in the film, he took improv performers from the Chicago-based comedy troupe The Groundlings to act as the voices of the appliances. Reese wanted the dialogue to feel natural and different from the other animated films being produced throughout the 80s. Another unusual choice for this time was having the voice actors play out their roles in group recording sessions, which gave the performers an emotional constant to work off of and a better opportunity to improvise. The only actor missing from these group sessions was Jon Lovitz. He had just been hired as a cast member on Saturday Night Live, but because the role of the radio had been developed with Lovitz in mind, he recorded all of his lines in one marathon session just one day before he was set to move to New York. The other cast members were Deanna Oliver as the title Toaster, Timothy Day as the Blanket, Tim Stack as Lampy, Turl Ravenscroft is Kirby, better known as the voice of Tony the Tiger. Phil Hartman is AC, Wayne Katz as the Master. Composer David Newman began work on the score during pre-production. Newman worked with Reese on figuring out the tone of the film, and both men decided to stay as close to the source novel's tone as possible. Instead of a childlike whimsy one would usually associate with animated films, Reese and Newman went on with a more melancholy mood. The film features 4 original songs by Van Dyke Parks and recorded by the New Japan Philharmonic. The Brave Little Toaster premiered on July 10th, 1987, and then went on the festival circuit, including the Sundance Film Festival in 1988, making it the first animated feature film to exhibit there. While the film was going to play in cinemas thanks to art house distributor Scorus Pictures, Disney forced the film to premiere instead as part of the Disney Channel. In July 1991, The Brave Little Toaster was released on VHS and Laserdisc, and in 2003, the Laserdisc transfer was copied to a DVD release. The Brave Little Toaster has remained unavailable on all streaming platforms and on-demand services, including Disney Plus, and can still only be viewed on the standard definition Laserdisc transfer. In the years since its release, The Brave Little Toaster has garnered kind of a cult following for its mature themes regarding loneliness, abandonment, sacrifice. It's a film that never condescends to its child audience. Beyond that, the crew behind the film has gone on to develop some of the most successful and critically lauded animated films ever produced, with many of them finding their footing working on this film. But what makes The Brave Little Toaster such a beloved film, and why does it carry such a loyal cult following? To answer that question, we have to talk about nihilism. The history of philosophy, as far back as human beings have been able to speak, can be broken down to this basic cycle. One person asserts a theoretical or observed truth, like we are alive, and another person responds to that assertion with one of their own. They'll either argue against it outright, we aren't alive, or they will dive into the specifics, what is alive? Western philosophy gets much of its foundational text from the Greeks. And then those texts were expanded upon or negated by the Romans and the church and the politicians who ran the church, and so on until literacy belonged not only to the ruling class, but to everybody. Once literacy stretches beyond the ruling class, those who actually live in proximity to the ails of society begin to look upon the works of those wealthy enough to have been literate throughout human history and make assertions of their own. That's why, starting around the middle of the 19th century, you see such an explosion of philosophical and scientific thought. Literacy belonging to the masses and printing presses, which are able to bring written work to the poor, negate much of the gatekeeping built into earlier philosophical texts. The early to mid-20th century is an important time for Western philosophy for a few reasons, even beyond widespread literacy. The first is the dissemination of information through mass media exploded into existence just as the regulated public education programs of developed Western nations began using pedagogy based on actual psychological research on the development of the human mind. The second reason is that the world went to war. Twice. Nihilism is a much misunderstood philosophical concept because of its nebulous place within the framework of Western philosophy. While movies like The Big Lebowski showcase nihilism as a simple disbelief in all systems, a more nuanced look at this construct can be found in the Best Picture-winning film Everything Everywhere All at Once, or Harold Ramis's masterpiece Groundhog Day. The films of Lars von Trier, particularly Melancholia and The House That Jack Built, revolve around a certain nihilism. Writers like Bret Easton Ellis portray nihilism in novels dating back to American Psycho. Filmmakers like Paul Schrader have made nihilism their whole thing. Even something like Robert Bresson's Pickpocket shows signs of the philosophy, as do the works of Michael Haneke. But what is it? We keep using that word, but does it mean what we think it means? Like most philosophical ideas that gained prominence in the early 20th century, the roots of nihilism go all the way back to the Greeks. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher and contemporary of Aristotle who founded the system of philosophy known as Epicureanism. In contrast to Plato, whose Platonic reliance on the abstract existence of mystical truth, Epicureanism is a skeptical and non-mystical view of the world. While Plato argues for an inherent truth observable and identical between all people, Epicurus rejects all mystical notions, arguing instead for worldly delight and the avoidance of pain and suffering. For Plato, pain and suffering are necessary evils in divining intrinsic truths about the world, and for Epicurus, pain and suffering should be avoided as we enjoy the gift of life. Much of Epicurus's work pertains very little to the purposes of this video, so let's focus on his most famous contribution to skeptics. When writing about the nature of the gods, Epicurus constructed a logical dilemma to illustrate the paradox of believing in a benevolent, all-knowing God. The paradox is as follows. If God knows everything and has unlimited power, then they have knowledge of all evil and have the power to put an end to it. But if they do not end it, they are not completely benevolent. If God has unlimited power and is completely good, then they have the power to extinguish evil and want to extinguish it. But if they do not do it, their knowledge of evil is limited, so they are not all-knowing. If a God is all-knowing and totally good, then they know of all the evil that exists and want to change it. But if they do not, which must be because they are not capable of changing it, they are not omnipotent. The Epicurus paradox is frequently used to note God's lack of involvement in human affairs. Epicurus himself was not an atheist, I should note, but instead rejected the notion that if there were some God out there, they would have no concern for the human realm. In 1779, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume wrote this in response to Epicurus's paradox. God's power is infinite. Whatever he desires is executed, but neither man nor any other animal is happy. Therefore, he does not want your happiness. His wisdom is infinite. He never errs in choosing the means to any end. But the course of nature tends to be contrary to any human or animal happiness. Therefore, it is not the established for such a purpose. Throughout the entire history of human knowledge, there are no more certain and infallible inferences than these. In what point, therefore, do your benevolence and mercy remind you of the benevolence and mercy of men? In 1862, Russian novelist Iron Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons popularized the term nihilism through the protagonist, Bazarov, whose disbelief not only in God but in any governing system helps him recruit several followers. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche is commonly associated with the concept of nihilism following his 1882 release of The Joyful Wisdom, where he famously wrote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" While God is dead has always been associated with a certain pessimism in regard to Nietzsche, the full context for this phrase suggests something more complicated. As Martin Heidegger points out in his essay, The World of Nietzsche, Nietzsche's words can only be understood as referring not to a particular theological or anthropological view, but rather to the end of philosophy itself. Philosophy has reached its maximum potential as metaphysics, and Nietzsche's words warn of its demise and the end of any metaphysical worldview. If metaphysics is dead, Heidegger warns, that is because from its inception that was its fate. In other words, Nietzsche's phrase exists to point out what Epicurus observed 2,000 years before. If people can't point to a god or system in full control of the universe, then the morals and ethics of the people inhabiting that universe must be of this world. It's easy to condense nihilistic theory into a simple binary. You either believe in something or you don't. But the broad picture of nihilism is as multifaceted and complex as any other centuries-old framework. Just like existentialism, absurdism, or deism all retain dozens of subcategories beneath their respective umbrellas. So too does nihilism. Of course, nihilism is often associated with some form of philosophical pessimism, specifically anomie, a social condition defined by uprooting or breaking down any moral values. But these are descriptions that provide no specificity. There's moral nihilism, passive and active nihilism, compositional nihilism, epistemological nihilism. It's all connected to one general skeptical assertion, but employed through different lenses and purposes. The Brave Little Toaster beautifully illustrates the Nietzschean philosophy of nihilism through both its central conflict and its many deviations. Much of the through line of the plot is right there in Thomas Dish's novel, but moments in the film not found in the source novel also closely align with Nietzsche's central nihilistic principles as described in The Will to Power and Thus Spake Zarathustra. As we work through the plot of the film, I'll stop and highlight key differences between the source material and the film, and I will also share passages of the novel communicating the interesting tone of that novel. I planned on purchasing a copy of the novel for this video, but the cheapest one I could find was $245 on eBay, so I downloaded the ebook. Let's talk about The Brave Little Toaster. The story of The Brave Little Toaster begins with an empty mountain cottage somewhere in the United States. According to the source novel, it's been 2 years since any human beings have set foot in the house, and in that time, the various appliances have grown depressed and impatient, awaiting the return of a young boy they call Master. The primary characters in both the film and the novel are an optimistic toaster, a dim-witted lamp called Lampy, a talkative radio called Radio, an infantile electric blanket called Blanky, and a cantankerous but soft-hearted vacuum cleaner called Kirby. The appliances are stir-crazy, waiting for the Master to return, but they secretly fear that he may never return to give them purpose. I should note here that while the film is certainly more lighthearted than the novel, both the novel and the film have much more muted and melancholy tones than most children's entertainment. What's missing from the film is the novel's somber narrator, who sometimes editorializes the events happening around the appliances. In the beginning of the novel, the narrator describes the mental struggle of the appliances. Quote, "They were all quite wretched and fretful and in a quandary as to what to do, for the 5 appliances had been abandoned. And the worst of it, said the radio, is not knowing why. For the appliances, Master is God. He is what gives them purpose in the world. Without the purpose of the Master, the appliances have lost touch with what it means to be alive. Like Nietzsche's concept of nihilism, without the purpose delivered from God, all life is just rote actions with no abstract meaning. As the appliances go about doing their chores, Blanket believes that here is a car. The appliances build a Tower of Babel structure to raise Blanket to the attic, but alas, it's a false alarm. The film is filled with these false hopes, and the desperate isolation felt by the appliances mirrors the very real feelings of abandonment we can feel in our own lives when the plan we have set before us doesn't come to fruition. The window unit air conditioner tells the appliances to stop looking forward to the Master's return. Toaster argues that the AC unit is just jealous because the Master never played with it and it's just stuck on the wall. The AC unit becomes so infuriated that it short circuits, screaming that it's not an invalid but instead designed perfectly for its function. The very idea that the Master would have no use or interest in the air conditioner sends it into such an existential rage that it explodes into sparks and dies in front of the other appliances. What are we, if not a series of functions designed by an outside force? If those functions are worthless, then what does that make us? A real estate agent hammers a for sale sign into the front yard, the final death knell in this forgotten place. Toaster, ever the optimist, comes up with a plan. If the Master won't come to them, then they must journey to reach the Master. The appliances are skeptical at first, but they also realize their usefulness is coming to a close. They either risk their lives facing an arduous journey, or they accept the fact that they've been abandoned by the very being that gave them purpose. In Danish director Lars von Trier's 2011 film Melancholia, 2 sisters are faced with the apocalyptic destruction of Earth by an incoming collision with another planet caught in the sun's orbit. In the first half of the film, Justine, played by Kirsten Dunst, spends her wedding night hardly able to muster even a smile. Her depression and anxiety regarding the uncertain future of her married life shadows each moment of her ceremony with a dark cloud. As the ceremony goes on, Justine slides further and further into darkness. Her depression extends beyond her wedding day and into the following months. Justine's sister, Claire, played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, which I don't really know how that works, helps Justine bathe, get herself out of bed, and interact with others. In these moments, Claire tries to remind Justine that life is worth living, that life is what we make of it. Melancholia realistically portrays the dangerous isolation depression forces upon those who suffer from it. It's an inexplicable feeling that nothing matters, nothing will matter, and that nothing can change it. As hard as Claire works to help Justine through this period, nothing gets through to her. Like the appliances and the brave little toaster, Justine feels utterly abandoned and alone. It's the lack of purpose she feels in her life that spreads like a contagion to those around her. When the window unit air conditioner self-destructs, it's in direct response to a feeling of purposelessness. Its sole function cannot be deployed, so what good is it? What's the difference between being alive and being dead for the air conditioning unit? For Justine, the thin barrier between life and death is demonstrated when she tells Claire, life is only on Earth and not for very long. In the second half of Melancholia, as the alien planet surges toward Earth, Justine is given new life. The aimless, purposeless future she so desperately feared vanishes, and she holds on to the certainty the coming apocalypse gives her. With time so short, she no longer has to worry about the chaos of the universe. For her sister, the opposite occurs. The future held promise. She had a happy marriage and a young child, and the daily anxieties of her life kept her always looking ahead. When the planet gets closer, Claire loses all hope. It's Justine, then, who must help Claire. Justine becomes calm and focused in the face of tragedy, and Claire's anxiety washes away all that once held her together. Both Justine and Claire suffer in this film, but for opposing reasons. For Justine, suffering comes from a lack of certainty, and for Claire, certainty causes suffering. The film is a narrative illustration of the core Nietzschean philosophy that those who hold on to outside forces for their purpose will only ever be lost. Melancholia isn't nihilistic because it's cynical about human nature or pessimistic about the future of our planet, but because its main characters experience a conflict between each other based on a lack of belief. Justine accepts the chaos reigns, feeling neither good nor bad about that fact. Claire rails against that same chaos, but it's Justine who the film appears to agree with, as she is the central perspective and last word on the final developments of the plot. Similarly, the characters in The Brave Little Toaster represent various points on a spectrum of nihilistic rejection and fear of abandonment. Like Melancholia, The Brave Little Toaster illustrates the many ways nihilism can destabilize our relationships to our own lives. Toaster is unwilling to compromise its ideals. It believes fully in the love of the master, and its optimism prevents it from losing focus of its goals. However, blind optimism without evidence represents an unquestioning, shallow view of the world. If pessimism is bred from despair, then optimism is bred from hope. Since Toaster has no reason to hope for the future, it must fail to think critically about its situation. If Toaster is optimistic about the future, then it hasn't paid attention to the past. Since nihilism is a lack of belief, not disbelief, then Toaster is unknowingly falling into a nihilistic pattern. Blanky has a childlike need for constant validation and support, unwilling or unable to provide comfort to itself, but only to others. Blanky's deep depression stems from the real situation these appliances have found themselves in. They are utterly abandoned by their god. Lampy uses reason to deduce truth logically, talking itself into believing in the master. However, Lampy fails to consider the situation for what it actually is, deluding itself into false hope. Radio ironically detaches itself from uncertainty, constantly using thought-silencing asides to distract itself from painful truth. Kirby has embraced the pointlessness of life. All hope and value is gone, leaving nothing but a bitter and cynical shell of a once content being. What makes cynicism separate from nihilism is that cynicism is born of despair and disbelief. A cynic will find joy in its detachment and its knowing disbelief, especially in the face of those who demonstrate ignorance. Kirby's joy seems to come from its ability to acknowledge reality as it is, not as it might one day be. Toaster tells the appliances that it's time to leave the mountain cottage, head to the city, and find the master, so they work together to fashion an office chair, which isn't alive for some reason, into a makeshift vehicle, attaching a car battery to its base for all the appliances to plug themselves into. Then they set out into the woods, singing a worship song for the master and stopping in a clearing to sleep for the night. That night, Blanky tries to cuddle with various friends, but nobody, not even Toaster, will have anything to do with it. It sleeps alone, on the ground. The next day, the appliances make their way through a dead forest. In a strange interlude, the appliances come upon a meadow and a pond, teeming with small animals. We're treated to a Busby Berkeley-esque dance number not dissimilar from one of the Gold Digger films. The scene highlights the special place each animal has on the food chain and where they fit into the ecosystem of these woods. The appliances, comically purposeless in the outdoor environment, watch on as these truly alien customs play out. In the novel, this scene plays out differently. Instead of a picturesque meadow, the appliances befriend a couple of squirrels who are like weirdly racist toward Polish people. One of the squirrels tells a mean-spirited joke, but the appliances, who have no race or gender or nation, are totally baffled by the point of it. The narrator says, quote, "Besides, if they understood such human notions of gender and race, which are alien to appliances, they would have disapproved the squirrel's jokes. Humor that targets a group encourages us to no longer recognize and respect our differences as individuals." Following this scene, the novel and film converge again as a daisy sees itself in the reflection on Toaster. The daisy brightens up and is filled with hope, but Toaster tells the daisy that it's only looking at a reflection, not a friend. In the novel, the narrator says, quote, "The daisy had genuinely fallen in love with its own reflection in the Toaster's face. Such a paradox has often been the basis for the most impassioned love." When Toaster walks away, the daisy sadly withers and begins to fall apart. It's a beautiful and sad and strange scene, and I recall this moment having deep and significant meaning to me as a child. The appliances leave and enter what looks like the redwood forest of Western California. That night, as the appliances make camp, Toaster treats Blanky with dignity. Lampy asks Toaster why it's being so nice to Blanky, and Toaster says it feels just like toasting bread. Lampy understands that feeling. It's like getting attention from the master. Toaster is realizing that purpose can come from within, but then it has a nightmare. Both the novel and the film contain the same nightmare sequence, but of course the film's depiction is way more visceral. When I was young, I had a hard time watching this sequence. The scene begins with Master putting bread in the toaster, but Toaster burns the bread. It can't perform what it was put on Earth to do, and as the toast burns up and catches on fire, a terrifying clown fireman sprays the toaster with water. The toaster outruns the wave of water, and the wave of water turns into a wall of forks, and the toaster is eventually hanging over a bathtub. All of these events would, of course, render the toaster incomplete, just like AC no longer being able to heat or cool the house. What would happen to Toaster if it could no longer toast? A storm wakes the appliances up, and Blanky is sent high up into the trees by the wind. In the source novel, it's the racist squirrels that save Blanky from the tree, but the film smartly allows the appliances to use their built-in functionality to rescue their friend. Lampy shines his light into the trees, and okay. They eventually find Blanky the next day, and Kirby uses his cord as a retractable pulley system. This is immediately followed by another scene not present in the source novel. The gang makes it to a canyon chasm thing separated by waterfall, and the team works together to create a daisy chain of their cords. And they start swinging themselves over the chasm, which works brilliantly, and oh no. Okay. Yeah. Kirby, left alone at the top of the cliff, jumps into the water. These scenes, playing back to back, tell kind of an interesting story about how the filmmakers view the themes of this novel and how they wish to translate them for audiences. The way this movie would probably work in the hands of Disney is the more predictable way. Not because Disney are inherently bad storytellers, but because the messaging of the film would obviously lean toward the more optimistic. In a story written expressly for children and distributed by a large multimedia conglomerate, you have certain expectations for messaging. You expect the appliances to find greater purpose in helping each other using their own independent functions and skills, building deeper bonds between one another and realizing they don't need the master at all. That's not really what happens in this movie. Instead, the film provides two scenes in a row which humble the appliances and remind them that they have no business being in the wilderness. They have no usefulness beyond their primary functions and no hope for happiness outside of being the master's possessions. Even as Kirby rescues the other appliances from the raging river, you get the sense that Kirby is surprised to find both himself and the other objects alive at all. A common misconception regarding nihilism is that it describes a person who has lost their will to live or their ability to believe in something. However, most nihilists don't know they're nihilists. It's not always a decision, but instead a lack of decision. These appliances don't disbelieve, but instead lack belief in a life outside of the master. That means their inherent worth is tied to him. After escaping the river, the appliances sink into a bog. This is the scene that upset me the most growing up. Not that the appliances are sinking into a pit in the middle of nowhere, but that without the master, they embrace death? Blakey says it's not scared as it sinks into nothingness. This scene is reminiscent of the incinerator scene in Toy Story 3, the famous one where they all hold hands. But what good is life without the one thing that matters? Right as all hope is lost, a pawn shop owner pulls the appliances from certain doom by radio's antenna. In the novel, the pawn shop owner is instead the owner of a landfill, but the film has made these locations two distinct places. In the pawn shop, the owner uses various spare parts of the appliances to fix others. His instruments are conveyed like surgical equipment, and the main characters are horrified to learn of their fates. Not unlike the character of Sid in Toy Story, the man is portrayed as other to the audience. While Sid is portrayed as a sadistic punk, the pawn shop owner is portrayed as an idiotic, overeating layabout. The misfit appliances from around the shop, all missing parts or rigged together with other machines, sing a song about how all life is doomed. We've now moved from nihilism to cynicism, a natural progression associated with becoming aware of your situation. I'll take this moment to talk about the strange celebrity impersonations littered around the film. We have Jack Nicholson, Peter Lorre, Bette Davis, Joan Rivers. Interesting choices for children's media. It's references like these where you're reminded of future Pixar releases. Anyway, the appliances escape the shop by imitating a ghost, just like in the source novel. In a baby carriage, the gang makes its way to the big city and eventually the master's apartment. The master is an adult now and heading to college. Before moving out, he's decided to go back to his old country cottage to collect the old appliances that have been rotting there for a few years. It's a real gift of the Magi situation. The state-of-the-art appliances in Master's city apartment throw our friends into a dump truck, and when the Master gets back from his disappointing return to the cottage, the old TV directs him to the city dump. One of the most devastating movies I've ever seen is Steven Spielberg's 2001 film AI, Artificial Intelligence. The film is based on the 1969 novella Super Toys Last All Summer Long, and the premise is similar to The Brave Little Toaster in its broad strokes. Essentially, what if an object loved its owner? You see this theme in all sorts of media, and in AI, the plot directly references the story of Pinocchio. In AI, a robot child played by Haley Joel Osment has been programmed to love a woman named Monica, whose real son suffers from a terminal illness. Everything is going fine until her biological son is cured of his illness and returns home. The biological son and the robot boy named David then become embroiled in a competition to win Monica's love. Obviously, the biological son wins, and Monica, unsure what to do, leaves David in the middle of a forest, abandoning him with his undying love. People have strong opinions about this movie, particularly its final act, but the thing I find most interesting about AI is its commitment to playing out the darkest elements of this story. What happens when the thing you love most in the world abandons you? In the story of Pinocchio, Geppetto the puppeteer loses Pinocchio to the temptations of the outside world, but in AI, it is David who is abandoned. Similarly, the appliances in The Brave Little Toaster are guilty of nothing. They are entirely innocent and betrayed by their god. The melancholy pervading the entirety of AI comes from the audience understanding something that David never will. Monica will never love him. David searches for the fictional blue fairy to solve his problems and make him a real boy, but we as the audience understand that the blue fairy is not real. David will never get the one thing he wants. His hero's journey is doomed. The same is true for Claire in Melancholia. She wants Justine to be happy, but Justine is not built for happiness. Claire wants her family to live long and healthy lives, but the planet is going to end. There is nothing she can do about it. No amount of praying or hoping will change that reality. These films aren't nihilistic because the characters refuse to believe in something. These films are nihilistic because the thing these characters believe in doesn't exist. It's not that they're pessimistic about the world or cynical about other people's intentions. It's that their beliefs themselves mean nothing in an indifferent world. When we watch as the appliances search for the master, we as an audience understand that the relationship the appliances have with the master is very different from the one he has with them. For him, they're useful tools that can be replaced and have been replaced. For the appliances, the master is their god. The newer appliances throw away the older ones because they literally function better. Just like Monica's biological son removing the need for David, these new appliances have allowed the master to forget the old ones. It's not because the master is evil or selfish, but instead because his relationship with them is fundamentally different. At the dump site, junk cars sing a song about death. They offer us a dirge as they are crushed right in front of us. If you think the incinerator scene in Toy Story 3 is dark, just remember that in this film, we literally watch these cars provide their final words before being crushed into tiny cubes. The TV at the master's apartment convinces the master to go to the junkyard, and as the appliances await their death, these cars are systematically killed in front of them. In the source novel, the narrator provides this haunting paragraph. The first car left feeling fatigued as it couldn't handle the pressures of work. The second car lived feeling depressed as it had no motivation to get started in any direction. The third lived with no sense of home as it drifted from place to place, never settling down. The fourth lived only knowing the feeling of fame, but did not know how to cope when it was later forgotten. The fifth lived without ever committing to a single love. The sixth lived through a trauma, after which it felt anxious to adapt and change. The seventh lived a life of selfish enjoyment without giving back to society. The eighth lived feeling valued only for its productivity, which it had lost with age. We are born, we serve our purpose, and then we die. No more and no less. In the film's climax, through a series of mishaps, the master ends up on a conveyor belt of doom. In that moment, the brave little toaster leaps bravely into the machinery of the trash compactor, sacrificing itself to save the life of the master, throwing itself into oblivion to serve a god that doesn't care, to serve a purpose it doesn't understand. Obviously, the film ends happily. Master takes the appliances back to the apartment, fixes the toaster good as new, and takes them all to his college dorm. But at no point does the master acknowledge the appliances beyond their absolute function and convenience. And the breakneck pacing of the last few minutes really just skim over the inevitable decline of these objects into disrepair and eventual death. Even the toaster's decision to sacrifice itself for the life of the master is met with ambivalence at best, and none of the other appliances really acknowledge the sacrifice's true value. It's a scene that confuses me because it implies that Toaster has not changed or learned anything in the runtime of the film. In the beginning of the movie, Toaster believes in the purity and infallibility of the master and trusts completely in his love. It travels miles through dangerous wilderness and endures trials beyond its comprehension, failing again and again. What lesson was learned? You would think the appliances would learn to respect their own values beyond their functions, or love one another as a unified team of misfits, but that never happens. Instead, the appliances just keep believing in the master, and they eventually end up in his trunk. The toaster was willing to die to protect the master, but the master doesn't care. What lesson is this movie really teaching? What do we gain from the toaster's sacrificial act? What is the message we take away? Friedrich Nietzsche implied that nihilism, true nihilism, happens to us. We trust in a system and devote ourselves to it, but we never really take a moment to understand why we're doing it. It's blind trust in something that may exist. We understand nihilism when that system is revealed as hollow or empty. The brave little toaster's message is so confounding because we are privy not only to the ideals and dreams of these objects, but in the total indifference of the master they're risking everything to unite with. It's a nihilistic text in every sense because we have the full story, and that's what makes The Brave Little Toaster such an interesting film in the pantheon of children's animation. Thank you so much for watching this entire video. If you made it this far, let me know. I'm really interested to see how many people actually finish these things, and I would really love feedback or really just any commentary on what you think of these ideas. What's a film that you think captures these ideas in an interesting way? What are some nihilistic films you've seen? Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, man. I make as many of these as I possibly can, and I would love to get to know you better.